All right, so we're back with another episode. This is episode 13 of the Corona Time podcast. This week we will be reviewing the movie Big Fish, which is a 2003 Tim Burton film. And it's pretty interesting, so we'll start and just dive right into it. Chris, what did you think of the film, or is there anything you want to talk about first?
Yeah, as a disclaimer, I will admit that I'm not the biggest Tim Burton fan. So there's a lot of films that I know that people love Tim Burton for. I've watched some of them. I can't remember off the top of my head. I have to look them up. But I've always been like, oh, it's good, but I don't like it that much. With this one, I found an interesting dynamic where I was watching it and I watched it basically almost in one sitting until I wanted to go to sleep one night, and it was the last 30 minutes I had to watch. So and for this one, Big Fish, I think I liked it because it was fanciful, but it blended in with the story and also the theme. I think that's why I could see why some people say this is probably one of his better top 3, top 5 movies, because it was an interesting weaving of his style of inserting fantasy and the spectacular with a story about a father and a son and a family, and it's basically a father story based of his life and connecting with his kid. So yeah, I enjoyed this movie a lot more than I expected, because I was already a little bit biased. I was like, oh, it's Tim Burton. Am I really gonna like this that much? Mm-hmm. I ended up enjoying it a lot more than I thought I would. So
yeah, I'm kind of the same way when it comes to some of Tim Burton's films. I believe it was Nightmare Before Christmas. I want to say was this film?
Elm Street. I thought it was Elm Street or something like that.
No, her.
Or is that a different film?
Yeah, that's a different film. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, there's been a couple films that I've seen of Tim Burton. It's been a long time, but I've never been that big a fan of his. But so as a disclaimer, I've actually seen this film Big Fish before. And Chris hadn't, which is why I chose this. But I actually really enjoyed this the first time I saw it, and it was still a good rewatch. Again, I thoroughly enjoyed it. This would have been either my second or third time seeing this, but it's been at least 10 years since I had seen this film. But yeah, I thought it was interesting. I believe this movie was based on a book, but this time when I watched it, it was just interesting because I picked up a lot on some of the metaphors that they were trying to use. Basically, this whole movie is just a lot of metaphors just laid on top of one another. And really, what you have to do quite a bit in this film is sort of read between the lines, right? Because the father, Edward Bloom, he loves to sort of embellish his tall tales, and you can't really figure out what is necessarily true all the time and what is fictional. So it's kind of interesting, sort of the way this story is weaved, because it comes from Edward Bloom telling his stories. So basically the film centers around a lot of his tall tales and his adventures in the past, and then you get pushed back into the present time, and so you're constantly going back and forth, and sometimes it's sort of hard to decipher what's actually really going on or what really happened.
Yeah, I agree. It seems like that's why I think the film fits kind of like Burton's style, because it's like the son at first believes all the stories are fake, right? Like he says that often in the beginning, this half the stuff didn't even happen, or even more than half the stuff didn't happen. That's why later in the movie he's shocked when he really his dad really was MIA. They thought he was MIA for a while, and when he was fighting in the Korean War. And at the end of the movie, a lot of the characters of these stories do show up to his funeral. And, they actually they look, I mean, I think it's part of the Burns style of they look kind of like in the story, but they're not as crazy, fantastic. They are fantastical in this sense, but they're not they're probably, like you said, embellished. And you have to, like you said, read between the lines of these fathers' tales. But a lot of the key events did occur. It's as the movie goes on, he learns more about his dad, trying to himself siphon through the let's say the fantasy and the real. And like you were saying, this film is like, I think why I like this movie because I think this like the center kind of like theme and story is really like the son father dynamic, and all the other stuff is like the mechanism how that comes about, like they connect and comes about. And I think at the end the son does understand. Will, I think his name is Will, understands Edward Bloom, his dad. But I was gonna ask about some of the beginning of like those beginning stories with like the giant,
Sure.
and how like the town was scared of this giant, and like how he talks to him. It was I thought it was interesting how you know, Edward Bloom has this like it's like almost it's a mini stereotype, right, of this like this optimistic like country boy, you know, like I feel like that's a trope that I feel like I've seen like many times either in books or in film or shows where like he's naive of the world, and he has this ultimate optimism about like the world around him, and he's going to figure it out. So I was interested in your take at like the beginning of the film, and also overall like any archetypes that you thought were kind of like, you know, interesting or rehashed.
Yeah, so I mean that idea of having the small town hero try to leave and make it for the big city, and like, you know, traditionally it's like these people sort of go to New York or Los Angeles, you know, the really big hubs to try to make it, right? That's a sort of cliche and a stereotype that's like, this is not the first time I've seen that or heard of it. A lot of people in real life that are from small towns, they do that, where they're like, you know, there's some of the big deals in their little towns of like 2,000 or 3,000, and then they basically think they have all this momentum where they can go anywhere and do sort of anything. So it's interesting because Edward Bloom's story sort of revolves around that stereotype. You know, he's that kid, he can do no wrong in his hometown. He's like a star football player. He sinks every shot. In a way, what was kind of, I think, the sort of archetype that I found interesting was in all those shots where he's the hero, you kind of see, I forgot the guy's name, but he was the ex-fiance of his wife, because they were both from the small town. Basically, he was the guy that was always in the shadows, right? It kind of reminded me of, even though they weren't related, like a David and, I'm sorry, not a David and Goliath. It kind of reminded me of a Cain and Abel type of dynamic, where it's like, you know, Edward was the one, he could do no wrong, his town hero, everything, and that other dude was kind of like Cain, kind of getting left in the shadows. That was kind of funny, and you kind of do see that in certain dynamics, more so with like family.
Yeah, that character was interesting because like he was always in the shot. Like, yeah, I'm thinking of the basketball shot.
Yeah.
And also later I guess where his story ends with the fight over the, you know, the fiance.
By the way, before we get into that, I just want to bring up one thing with that basketball. Another cliche that was present in this film, I don't know if you've caught it, but Hollywood is so guilty of this, is, of course, given that this was still in Jim Crow era Alabama, you're not going to see a lot of diversity there, but of course they have to throw in one black basketball player on the team. I'm like, really? Like there's so many Hollywood films where they have to have like a token minority there. And I was just like, well, this film fell into that trap too.
Yeah, because it's unrealistic. Like, so I'm going to bring it back real quick, but I read the Pete Maravich autobiography, and he played in an era where, you know, there was a white league and there was a black league. Yeah. And he played at LSU. And obviously the critique on him, like from historians, is that his stats are probably like, I want to say inflated. Oh, I'm going to say inflated because like he didn't play against maybe the
top competition
overall players, black or white. And he's famous for, I think, averaging like 50 or 40, or I forgot if it was 40 or 50 points per year in college basketball. But to your point, why it's unrealistic is because when I was reading that book, it emphasizes that there was like literally like you were saying with that scene, even at the high school level, there was clearly like a white team playing each other. There was there was not even a token black guy. That's a film thing because they weren't even allowed to play together until, you know, obviously when civil rights and other social movements, like, you know, kick down those doors. So yeah, I agree with you that like it's the typical, like, if you're gonna do something in, you know, rural, like, you know, Alabama, that's not realistic. There was probably often not a token African American on a team. There's probably none. So
unfortunately, at that point, the times and the tensions in society were just too brutal, and In Alabama, they would not have allowed that to happen, unfortunately.
I think in general, you actually don't see a lot of diversity in this film. I mean, obviously the story is about like these two, like this family, but like obviously we know that there was a lot of African Americans in Alabama, but they're not really like portrayed in this film. Which I'm not one of those people that believes that like they have to like insert diversity to insert diversity. So if this story is really just about like I said, based on a book, and it's about the story's son, the father and the son, like makes 100% like sense. But yeah, the basketball thing, I'm so used to it that it glosses over to me. But I've read enough basketball like history to know that like that's not realistic.
Yeah, it wasn't at the times. But anyway, so going forward, were there any sort of archetypes that you found interesting? Because this film is riddled with sort of metaphor throughout, especially it's really laced in as tall tales. It's told by Edward Bloom.
Yeah, I mean the ones that I thought were kind of like interesting, like were funny. The witch one with the eye was good. Obviously with the two Asian, let's say I'm gonna call them twins. Yeah, it's an archetype. Yeah,
the conjoined twins.
The conjoined twins. I mean, that also like speaking of on the Asian perspective, I know that like in American culture, like the Chinese twins things is like overdone like a lot.
Yes.
And especially girl twins. Have you ever noticed that there's never guy twins? It's always girl twins. Oh, I adopted two beautiful Chinese girl twins. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a lot like in this film because it's how do I say it correctly? Like it's almost like a story about a story, right? Like ignoring the novel, right? Even like the story of this film is about a father who tells stories, so it's almost a bit meta too. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is there like I mean I could keep rambling, but is there any like specific like story you want to start with and break it down a little bit?
Yeah, I mean let's go in with the sort of from the beginning or like one of the more beginning scenes. What did you think about the town of Spectre?
Okay. Yeah, okay. I didn't know you were gonna start there. So I thought it was a typical over-romanticized small town. Oh, we're not corrupted by the outside world, right? Because later in the movie, we learn that the town declined because, bankers got in there. Now, I'm not the biggest defender of bankers, so I'm not even going to go there. But so Edward goes to this town, Spectre, like you were saying, and it's like almost perfect, right? Oh, everybody has businesses, is self-sustaining. People are so happy, dancing around. But I will say this, I'm going to bring my 21st century critique on it. Okay, fine. But I didn't see minorities. I didn't see poor people. I was like, this is totally fanciful. Like, this is like a typical, like, over-idealized small town.
It's supposed to be, right? Because the road to Spectre is riddled with chaos and terror. And then you get to basically like this heaven, right? The more difficult road leads to like a greater prize kind of cliche, right? And that's really what they were trying to sort of emphasize there. Except when he gets there, Edward Bloom's a little disillusioned. But go ahead.
And to show you that this is way before like Me Too blew up, I like how obviously this character would grow up, but like I love I don't actually love him. I don't want to say love actually. The insinuation. I think her character, like when she's a girl, it's Jenny, right? And then she becomes like the witch, and obviously later we'll get into that. I love how I don't love. Sorry, I don't want to use that word. But it's more.
You find it amusing or entertaining.
I want to make a mockery of it. That like she says, "Oh, 10 years isn't that much of a difference." I'm like, that's true, but you look like you're 8. Like, like this guy looks like he's like 18.
Yeah, at least.
This is messed up a little bit. And so Hollywood has this problem. I will say this is probably why the Me Too blew up in Hollywood specifically. There is this over-sexualization of young females in Hollywood. I think in society too, but definitely in the movie industry and the film industry, because I listened to this fantastic interview with Megan Fox. I know everybody has their judgments about her, but at least on a human level, I kind of like felt a lot of empathy, because she was talking about how her career has been like basically that she's been over sexualized, even though like
Dude, wasn't she 17 when the Transformers came out or something like that?
Yeah, but I think even there was even some other like TV shows where like even how
Yeah.
she made her big break, she played really well. Maybe because of how she talked. She even said that's her natural voice, but like people say like she has a very slutty voice, you know, and like even how her body is, and so, and she spoke about how like she feels that like her career got pigeonholed, and we hear this a lot about actors in general, right? But it was interesting to hear her talk because I always thought of pigeonholed as like, oh, I can only play the cowboy, I can only play the superhero. Like we saw, we ever talk about like Birdman or anything, but she talked about how like she only can play like this over sexualized doll, and I was like, wow, that's actually like kind of true. And then she talked about how, and then
that is unfortunately true with typecasting. But go ahead.
And she talked about how when she got older and had kids, that there isn't really Hollywood doesn't really reward mothers. That she was having to fight and negotiate because before they do films, they negotiate the contracts and stuff, and she was having to fight for like just the ability to breastfeed your baby on set because time is money in Hollywood too, like any other industry. And she was like, how do you like this is not like a mother friendly culture because I'm having to fight for. She said she listed it like I'm having to fight for breastfeeding time just to take a breather because when you're obviously a new mother, like your body changes and also like your responsibilities do, and she found it totally like unsustainable. That's why she's kind of removed herself. I think we've all noticed, right? She's kind of removed herself from like a lot of movies.
Well, she's been a bit in the spotlight lately because I think she divorced her husband and now she's been dating rapper Machine Gun Kelly. That's been like the latest with her. But anyway, go ahead.
But I mean, in terms of her career, right? Like she was in the limelight with those Michael Bay movies. Who Michael Bay, by the way, I mean that guy like not only
we're not even gonna get into that. But anyway.
But sorry to go back to Spectre here. What I'm saying is that like in this particular scene, and it's totally normalized, right? I don't even think they're doing a critique or anything. It's just like, oh, it's not that much. I think it's unfortunately I think that Hollywood until recently has really like they've internalized that. They're like, oh, it's fine. It's as long as when she gets legal, it should be okay, right? But I think you see this a lot with like teen movies and also modern movies like Transformers, like you were saying, and others that there is this over sexualization of basically people under 18. And I think that's something that needs to be talked about more and addressed. And
it's totally evident by that dynamic between Jenny and Edward Bloom.
But yeah, it emphasizes my point that like that town inspector is totally like an over idealized farce. There we go. That's the word I was looking for.
Of course, but I think they wanted to get a little deeper with that, right? Because it's supposed to be painted with as this like perfect place, right? That's what they're the ground's so soft you don't even need shoes to walk. That's what they tell them when they take the shoes. It's this like complete
bubble
over idealized place. But I mean that comes it's kind of a trap, right? Because I'll bring it with the other character that he meets there from Ashton, Norther, the poet. I forgot his last name, but his name's Norther. He had been working, and he'd been a famous poet prior to going to Spectre. And then he's like, oh, yeah, well, I've been here like 12 years just working on my poem. And then Edward Bloom's interacting with him, and he's like, oh, can I see like what you have so far? Maybe I can give you some feedback. And he's like, roses are red, violets are blue, Spectre is beautiful. And that was it. And it's kind of interesting because I get what they were going with that, where it's like you're living in a place that's basically like paradise. And so your inspiration and dealings with the real world, you're completely removed from that. And your inspiration for your art of poetry has vanished. And so you can't make good art anymore when you're in a place that is so removed and so unrelatable to the real world.
Yeah, his art became bland. Like there was nothing.
There's no inspiration for him.
There was nothing to build upon, right? It was just, this place is perfect. That's all he could think of,
What was interesting and what it kind of reminded me of is I've showed you this artist before. A lot of you probably have never heard of this rapper, but there's a rapper named Marlon Craft who's from New York, and he has this pretty interesting song called Lonely. You'll see where I'm getting with this in a second. But in the song Lonely, he talks about, dealing with some anxiety and depression type of issues, and he hopes that he can overcome them. But he's worried if he stops feeling like he's lonely, then his art might suffer as a consequence because he thinks that might be the inspiration for what drives him to make good art. It's really interesting because it's like some of the things that you feel might be, making you less happy might be the reason that your art is truly sort of transcending.
to build upon that, no, I your point is totally makes sense because I'm thinking that this archetype is like age is old because I know that people analyze Van Gogh saying like if he didn't have his, his own like mental background, like would he be able to produce the art that he does? It's like they call it. I forgot what the technical term is, but it's like that genius dilemma of like I am who I am because of my pain, and so if I don't have this pain, I can't be great.
Will I be that great?
Yeah, it reminds me of like I was a big Dr. House fan in high school, and he often like his coworkers and friends would say, why do you keep taking the Vicodin? Why do you keep trying to like use the pain as a crutch? And he's like, I think I'm only a good doctor because of this crutch, and so like. You see this often with like these I would say high level artist genius types where they think that only part of the reason they are successful is because of their resilience to these traumas or to these events. So I definitely see the analysis and the point there, and I think it's up to debate if that's true or not. So
it's hard, right? But I'll give you another example. Very famous Russian author Dostoevsky in the 1800s. He has made some great work or like written some great books, including Crime and Punishment. But he was known throughout his career to have suffered from seizures, right? And he said that in those moments where he had seizures, he got some of his greatest insights. And some of his work is, you can talk to a lot of people who's read his work, it's almost transcending. And he's even said that he's like, yeah, it was because of those seizures, what sort of I experienced within them, that allowed me to reach my sort of higher levels within my work. And he's like, he was saying that he wouldn't trade those for anything, those sort of moments of insight. So it's really interesting because seizures are a brutal thing. It's really making your body suffer tremendously, but yet it allows some reason within that experience, he was able to produce something so noteworthy and transcending. I mean, he's still considered one of the best authors of all time. And yeah, that is up for debate. Does your pain, do these like horrible experiences lead you to create art that is so sort of transcending and so meta, if you will?
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, that was sort of the archetype that I saw within Norther, the poet, within this. It's like, oh, okay, I see. I've seen this cliche, but it was actually really well done, and I got it. And eventually, after Edward Bloom left town, that sort of gave him the inspiration to leave this paradise.
Yeah, and try it on his own, which we'll see him later, so we'll get to that.
Yeah,
for sure. I was trying to think. The wife's name. I'm trying to remember her. Shoot, no, wait. Was it Sandra?
Sandra.
Yeah. So what did you think of like? That's another archetype trope that I wonder if, like, again, with a more modern, 20. It's made in the 21st century, but let's say more modern. Let's say the last 10 years of like, let's say academic analysis. I'm gonna call it that. She plays like this almost perfect, dutiful wife, right? And I know that in reading a lot of like modern feminist literature, there's a big agitation towards that trope because they find it very unrealistic, but also it sets like bad expectations of what relationships should be like, right? Because like Edward Bloom, he sees her once, okay, falls in love with her, fights for her, all that cliches, right? But her character is really like throughout the story is very like almost like a how do I say it? Like, she kind of floats through the story, right? Like, obviously the emphasis isn't on her relationship with her son because it seems like that's a good relationship, but it's more of, a emphasis on obviously the father-son. But I found her character to be like, important for Edward, but like she wasn't really a standalone character in her own way because all her kind of like important scenes, they either revolved her son or Edward, And I know that like in the modern,
except when she got married.
Yeah. So obviously she was important to the family unit, but I want to bring up again that like it's one of those another character where it's just used as like a storytelling mechanism versus like kind of maybe exploring her own character because like okay, she falls in love with Edward after that scuffle with I don't know the guy's name, but yeah, the big dude that was just you know, let's say the antithesis to Edward. And obviously she, you know, she's there when he goes off to war, and like she helps raise Will, and she has important scenes throughout. But yeah, I want to get your take on, like, you know, obviously it's interesting watching a movie because you're right, it's 2003. And even though like we think at the time it's like, oh, this is the modern era, I was watching this movie with a lot of like, wow, this was like people were probably like, oh, this is totally fine. And now like people today are like kind of in many ways like critiquing and ripping a lot of these movies. I can't remember the term for it, because I wonder if this movie even passes. There's just this famous test I remember in college when I was taking some sociology classes. Not that I recommend that, but there was this famous test that they went through movies. I forgot what it's called. I might look it up while you're talking. That tested movies if there was any real meaningful conversations between female to female characters that did not involve, here's a trick, that did not involve talking about a man or anything related to a man. So like if two female characters were talking about their son or their men or their husbands, it didn't count. So I don't think this movie would have passed that.
In this film, it most certainly didn't. I mean, look, this was a film that was exploring really the relationship between the father and son dynamic, right? And so the point of emphasis was not on, unfortunately, any female characters. And so there's only a handful of instances where you really even hear the mom talk, right? Because it deals with the son. I mean, the main storyline is a son that feels like he can't really connect with his father, that his father has never been real with him his whole time in his life. And he's trying to sort of reconcile and forgive him for that, right?
Yeah.
That's really what the whole movie's about. It was not really a movie that it's focused on a mother and son dynamic.
So I wanted to set that backdrop because I'm curious what you thought about how Edward like really pursues her hard. Because nowadays I feel like it's a gray area. Like if the chick likes that or the woman like is like there's like a mutual attraction, the storyline is, oh, what a courageous, you know, gentleman. And if it's not mutual, it's always like now they just say, oh, this guy's like creepy and like stalkerish. He needs to like back off.
In reality, that storyline does not happen, right? You're not going to see someone like, more often than not, you're going to have the woman call like campus PD and escort this dude out and leave her alone. But obviously this is supposed to be like a fantasy sort of fairy tale telling. You don't even really know that's, you know, they met at Auburn. You don't know how exactly their interaction really went down. That's just Edward telling his tall tales of, I mean, it was to the point where he brings a dang, dandelion field in front of the sorority. Yeah. So obviously that's not like really what went down. That's just Edward's rendition of what happened. Now, if someone like clearly like today or even back then, some guy was that persistent, you're going to basically say he's a stalker, and that's going to be essentially the end of it. Now, what I will say is what works in Edward's favor is he's a really good smooth talker, and he's pretty attractive for a male, both of which work in his favor when it comes to trying to pursue somebody. Yeah.
I know you mentioned earlier how like these tall tales are embellished, and I think like a lot of these grand gestures are embellished. But I like, you know, throughout the film, it's hinted that like there is some subtle truths. I think probably what did happen was his character did, you know, pursue heavily, and even though she said she was, engaged, like he, tried to, in a sense, well, he did end up breaking that up, but he tried to put himself as a wedge. So I think. In this tall tale, and it's to interpretation, but in this tall tale, I think, like these grand gestures were overdone, but I think he did like try his best to.
Sure, yeah. And in this case, Edward Bloom was like the OG Mr. Steal Your Girl, literally.
Yeah.
In this story, because he literally broke up an engagement, which was it was pretty wild. But and so I guess like the next part, because it sort of circles into it, is what did you think about his next interaction with Norther back in West Texas once he becomes a salesman?
I thought we were going to talk about the circus a little bit with the Danny DeVito's characters. So I think that happens before the bank. Yeah.
Oh, that's way before. That was way before. Yeah, well, yeah, we could talk about that. So yeah, with Danny DeVito's character, he played.
Yeah, he's so funny, dude.
He's another archetypal character that you find out really is a werewolf, right? I thought that was actually pretty interesting, sort of some of the commentary there, because Danny DeVito as a werewolf attacks Edward Bloom, right? But then he gets a stick and then just plays fetch with him all night long. And he kind of realizes, and I think there is a great degree of truth to this. He's like, you often see that the most like what you would consider most intimidating or fearful things you're afraid of are often just lonely. And what that really reminded me of is, have you seen The Sandlot before?
Doesn't click.
You've never seen them. So the movie The Sandlot it's a slight little digression, but it relates. It's this movie about these kids. It's kind of growing up. They just play baseball. It's an idealized world too, over idealized, like back to the 50s. It's just a bunch of kids who are playing baseball and growing up. But at one point, one of the main characters, I forgot his name. It's been so long since I've seen the movie, but he hits the ball, one of his dad's balls, over the fence. Except he doesn't know that, or it's his stepdad. Stepdad's ball hits it over the fence, but it's a ball that's signed by Babe Ruth. And the kid doesn't really know who Babe Ruth is. He's just trying to get into baseball. And they go and it lands in the neighbor's yard. Well, the neighbor's yard has this monstrous dog, right? And long story short, they end up like devising a plan to get the ball from the dog. And they think that the dog is just a monster, but in reality, he's just, this friendly dog who's just an old dog by himself, right? So oftentimes the things that you perceive to be the scares are just like kind of like lonely, if you will. It's just like what you fabricated in your mind of the perception of certain things ends up not being true.
Yeah, I was actually going to go with one of my favorite scenes in this movie is DeVito getting Carl to sign his rights away, because obviously he's like, oh, this guy's gonna be great for this character. He's like, you're okay with
indentured servitude.
Yeah, it's like indentured servitude, and also like no liability. Like if you get hurt, and like he says it all quickly. He's just like, let him sign. I'm just like, this does sadly happen today still. Where like, please sign this and sign all your rights away because we don't want to get sued. But I was laughing because I was just like, oh my goodness. And I thought he wasn't going to sign it, but I was like, okay, he probably doesn't know. And he just signed it. But I was cracking up because DeVito is so funny. Because he's hilarious. I've been watching a lot of Sunny. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia recently, and he's just hilarious. Dude.
So this was a couple of years before It's Always Sunny.
Yeah.
So, because a lot of people know Danny DeVito today from that show. It's been so popular and it's still running. Since he also
has that famous episode in Friends too. But
right, the part that kind of gets me is actually right before that, when they unveil Colossus, right, the fire-breathing giant, who's tiny in comparison to this giant, and so you see him, and like Colossus, the crowd's going crazy because he's fire breathing, and then you hear he's done with his act, and then you hear the thuds of the actual giant come in, and you just see Colossus kind of like look down on his head like, well, I'm screwed here, and he like walks off. He just such defeat. For some reason, that part just like really killed me when I like first saw it.
Yeah, he's like, I'm out of a job. I think he even gets in a truck later and just leaves, right?
Yeah, he does. He was literally like the definition of like that SpongeBob meme. All right, I'm gonna head out.
Yeah,
because he knew he was done at that point. But anyway, and I like DeVito's character. He played a great ringmaster. I mean, I don't think anyone else could have like made that role quite as funny as DeVito did.
Yeah, I agree. Anyways, we can jump on the bank when we see Northerner again.
Northern,
yeah. When we see him again,
not Northerner, Northern.
I almost feel my interpretation the first time I heard his name was like, oh, is this guy like he's named that because all the bankers are in New York City? But I might have been too cynical there.
This film is kind of interesting, cause especially within that sort of sequence when they're in West Texas, because it touches upon some really sad economic truths that really do affect some of these communities out in West Texas. They were specifically talking about the how oil speculation really screws a lot of these communities, which unfortunately has been true throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I haven't really
with the fracking boom
recently, but yeah.
The fracking boom, trust me, the fracking boom is amazing.
Yeah, the fracking boom has kind of moved up. It's not just in Texas now; it's moved all the way up into the Dakotas. But
Energy
yeah,
independence for America.
it devastates a lot of these communities, especially once they decide to pull out investment.
Oh, and also the problem is that it's there's over speculation. So like when it does, like let's say like the profits crumble, like they
Hmm.
just go bankrupt, and so all these communities are left with no cash. So
Yeah, they're just screwed, which is essentially what happens because they look at the savings and loans bank and they're like, "I'm sorry," and they have a little pouch and it's got like $10 in it. They're like, "We're completely bankrupt." It's like that's so sad. And so then what I found funny was that you're talking about criminals and robbing banks, and he's like, no, this is small time. I want to go to the big leagues of criminals, and so he heads to Wall Street. Cracked me up because I was like, oh, that's so true, and then he ends up just becoming like a stock trader over there.
yeah, making money and helping Edward buy his first house. But
Yep.
yeah, it's like I think it starts because they're in the car, right? He's like, he's like, actually, because Edward put money in there because it was literally empty, and so he didn't want him to leave empty-handed. So he gave him like
He
10
put
bucks.
his check and his check.
Yeah, and then they start talking about like you're saying like like you said quickly going through like they did like they speculated and like the bankers left with their cash and the community's devastated. So he's like, yeah, this is small time, like you're saying. Like, I should go to Wall Street to get the big time crooks. The
Oh, essentially.
But yeah, it's I agree. Or like it was a good jab because also he talks about Spectre again, right? Because it ties in. I think that's the next scene, or before. I forgot what the time is, but like they talk. I think it's later because they talk about how Spectre like the there was bad loans, over speculation, and destroyed the town. And yeah, I mean there was that subtle shot at what I think is like how banking is viewed. I think unfortunately banking is now viewed like a speculative tool, which it is in many ways. Because before, like they would have been a little more rigorous like requirements with loans and how they did that. But now it's kind of like if you just pass whatever bar there is, you just get a big check, which is not really your money; it's really debt. But I think people often confuse money with debt. And yeah, I thought it was that was a funny sequence. Yeah, and it was like a superficial but good shots at who many people view as the real criminals of our society are, versus the small time thief that steals a banana or apple.
Right. Yeah. So for the next part, yeah, I think it does segue, or it does sort of go into. I believe the next sequence is when he heads back to Spectre. And so, what did you think of that at that point? Because now this idealized world has become, or like little town has become corrupted by the outside world.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very standard archetype trope. I thought it was interesting because, like I said, it ties in with that previous,
Notion.
that previous notion of the corruption of financialization and Wall Street, and kind of like how that innocent town got decimated, and how Edward Blue wants to like rebuild it, right? Mm-hmm. And also they make an interesting like I say like I'm gonna say metaphor. I don't think it's a metaphor, but it's an interesting like kind of like message of fate, where like they say in the beginning he arrived too early, and now he arrived too late. So he was supposed to arrive somewhere in between there. And so yeah, he makes it his mission to help rebuild this town with help with foreign money, like all the people he's met, donating or not donating, investing, and like him rebuilding the town. And that's where he reconnects with Jenny, right? Who later tries to put the moves on him, but he's married already. I thought it was like, I thought that whole kind of like story was really about like revealing to Will that his dad was not who he thought he was. Because I think growing up, Will thought his dad was just this bumbling traveling salesman that got drunk too much, and probably he even admits that he thought the worst of his dad. Right? Oh, he probably had affairs on the road, and and had all these excursions because he was never with them because he was on the road all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But he gets told like something completely different, right? That he was on the road, doing his job, but he was also trying to rebuild this town that had been decimated by corrupt I'm going to say corrupt speculators. And
so I want to ask you something then based on that. Do you think that Jenny was actually telling the truth in that story?
I think so, because if she had told him like all the bad things, if it was really like terrible, then I think the story structure, how I view this film story structure, is a son used to believe in his dad because he was a kid and he loved these stories. Then he starts realizing that some of these stories don't match up with what he was seeing as a child. Like, oh, he's gone all the time, all these great adventures, but how come he's not bringing us? And he hints at that, Will, that he feels that like his dad was not really involved. And actually, the doctor later tells him that his dad did miss his birth, you know, and he felt terrible about it. So my interpretation is that, because I also think that I haven't read the book, but I think this story is more on the side of optimism than pessimism. Usually you could tell a tone of the movie pretty early, or at least throughout the film. And I think she was, so I'm basically a long-winded answer, but I think she was telling like the truth. And I think it fits narratively with how this story ends when we get there. So.
Okay, I'm actually probably going to disagree with you here. This might be one of the first. So to sort of explain why I disagree with you, you have to sort of come up with or explain what the analogy of the big fish is. So from my sort of interpretation, the big fish is supposed to represent two things. One is the idea, sort of the cliche of you're a big fish in a small pond, so you need to get out. That's sort of the representation of Edward Bloom really needing to leave his town because that little town represents a small pond, so he needs to get out to sort of be able to grow even further, right? And the second representation is really the big fish represents his wife, in that he tries to catch the big fish, he puts up a big fight, but in reality, what does he say? That the fish swallows his wedding ring, right? Well, what that wedding ring kind of represents in that sort of case is his fidelity, his sort of trust that, you know, he will always remain loyal and faithful to his wife. But in one of the cases, he actually gets the wedding. Essentially, what ends up happening is the fish, I believe, either spits out the wedding ring or something happens where Edward gets the wedding ring back from the fish. In my sort of understanding, that represents that at one point or another he was unfaithful to his wife, because what does he end up doing in the end is, at the end of final story, one of the key features is that Edward Bloom removes his ring and gives it back to his wife, sort of in a way illustrating because it's his son telling the story, he includes that in there in a way to know that I know what really happened. I can read in between the lines of your story. And so I'm returning the ring to your wife to show that sort of that trust has been restored. And that in a sense, the son is saying, I forgive you for that indiscretion.
Interesting. Yeah, I can kind of see that interpretation. I think what Jenny wanted to do is... Go ahead. I
think what Jenny wanted to do is sort of save face with his son. Really shows a lot of the good that his dad had done in his life in the community, because the son he had a lot of difficulty like dealing with his dad because his dad was never really around. And so I don't think that Jenny really wanted to soil that even further or sour that even further. So she basically saved that face that, you know, he didn't that in that story, her rendition, he didn't cheat on his wife with her, and that she wanted to paint him as sort of the good guy that just came and saved the town, which he did do, but I think he actually did cheat on his wife.
And I can almost imagine that the answer to this question, so actually I think your interpretation is so plausible that it's probably correct. But I imagine the book clarifies. I bet you the book, I bet it's even stated or one or the other.
In the book, it is heavily implied he cheated.
Okay, so I was saying, like, this is the issue with, obviously, when you adapt books, is that, like, it's sometimes hard to take literary, like, metaphor, which is a little more, sometimes very clear, right? Like, you can read it over and over again, or it's very, like you said, it's probably, like you said, I bet, like, in that sense, I bet your interpretation is correct, because, like, if it is implied in the novel, then it's probably correct. I was saying, as a first-time viewer that had no prior knowledge of the book, or even, like, any Reddit or any interpretation, I think thematically, like, I bought it that, like, you know, he was discovering that his dad wasn't the kind of like the devil he thought. I see it as a story of reconciliation, this whole movie. So
yeah, it really is. Now, his dad is not the sort of complete hero that he paints himself out to be, and he's not the complete devil that his son really kind of thinks he is, right? Just making everything up. Because there are truths to what he tells. Like, there's truth that the Chinese sisters were twins, they just weren't conjoined twins, right? So he fabricated certain things and left out others.
And
I think in his storytelling, the dad was too ashamed to really admit that he cheated on his wife at one point, so he used a lot of metaphor and allegory.
And this is where now we're getting to more film analysis, because I wonder, like, I didn't get a chance to read any Burton interviews about this movie, but I wonder if, like, because, you know, with adaptations, sometimes what you do as an artist, as a director, is you pay homage to maybe a certain story point, but you don't build it into your movie because it doesn't make sense in the 2-hour window you have. Mm-hmm. So it could be one of those things where, like, he read the book, was very aware that this was one of those dynamics, and he weaved it in a way where it wasn't explicit, you know, but it wasn't dismissed. So it could have been in that middle ground too, where it's like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to his story if you believe A or B, because he wants to send a certain, you know, narrative message. Yeah. But it's the trick of being a director and adapting things, right?
I think Burton's choice of sort of leaving that kind of a more gray area for you to really sort of pick out that that's actually what really happened, and not explicitly say it, and not like overly give it away. I think that was a good choice in sort of the direction of the film.
Yeah, adds to the kind of like the magic or the ambiguity.
The magic of it, yeah. I think the ambiguity adds to the magic of the film and sort of the storyline. But yeah, I thought the sort of analogy of, well, the movie's name is Big Fish, but having the analogy of a big fish as a metaphor was pretty interesting. I think it worked really well for this film.
Yeah, I imagine that the book is usually, the books are always a little bit better than the films.
Yeah.
I imagine that the book also, like, it pulls a lot of that, you know, analogy stuff, you know, throughout the novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but anyway, I think we've covered most of it. Or is there anything else you wanted to touch upon? I'm trying to remember. Oh, what did you think about the ending of the film?
Before we get into it, I was gonna ask you if you bought maybe the book. I mean, I bought it, but I was curious if you bought the path of reconciliation the father and son did have in this movie, because, you know, I'm just talking about the movie because, like, you know, obviously it's an adaptation, because I don't know, I didn't read the books, I don't know if the book did it better or worse, but at least in the movie, like, in that sense, did you buy the arc? You know, I actually kind of did, but I was curious about what you thought.
That he did. Did I buy the arc? Yeah, I actually did. I thought really he was starting to sort of see the idea that his father was telling certain truths, and really, like, I think his sort of idea of his father just being completely, like, full of garbage and just had, like, all he would do is tell tall tales. That sort of understanding started to unravel. Whereas when he was a kid, he believed everything. When he was an adult, he started to believe nothing. And then as he started to get closer to his dad and dig a little deeper and find evidence, then he realized it was somewhere in the middle a bit. And then he started to realize really his dad wasn't necessarily, even though he wasn't always around, he wasn't that bad of a guy. Now, what I will say, the part that I find it kind of hard to believe and a little unbelievable, like, I believe it, but I can see the other side is, like, I personally know, like, people even within my family that have not necessarily had their dad present in their lives, and they still have not been able to reconcile with it. They weren't able to reconcile with their mom either. A lot of it was because their dad was never really around when they were growing up. So, like, I think it just depends on the person, right?
I agree. Like, it's very obvious, and I bet if I read more, like, you know, blogs and stuff, that the big theme is that reconciliation between parent and child. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think that's why I wanted to ask, because I think it depends on, like, probably one's perspective, one's experience is this truly believable? And I bet even the people who made the movie, like the writers involved and directors involved, they probably often, I bet you they have their own also interpretations, which I think we saw on screen a little bit.
Well, I think it was some of these stories and experiences were also influenced by a couple of the screenwriters. I believe I read that somewhere.
That would make sense.
I mean, because you can pick out, like, really, it's a universal sort of dynamic, right? Parent and son, or parent and child.
Yeah, so in the context of this story, I bought it, but I think as a whole, like you said, I agree with you where it sort of depends on the person and the experiences because yeah, like you said, this Edward Bloom wasn't as heroic as he portrayed himself, and he wasn't as bad as like the son at one point
Some
demonized him
believe.
for.
Yeah.
It was in the middle, and so I think, and because even though he was not there because of his work, it seemed like he still genuinely cared about his family, and
Mm-hmm.
he tried to at least like tell these stories to his son and like do some activity. There's many parents who just they totally it's like black and white, right? Like, oh, you have food on the table, that's good enough. Like, I don't have to interact with you too much. I have my own hobbies, you do your own thing. So I think it depends like on the circumstances of what the entirety of that relationship was. And also like
Right.
the other parent, like you said, like I'm using this case as the the mother being like the third party because it can easily flip to the dad being the more of the glue. But yeah, because also the mother didn't like hate the dad, Edward Bloom's character,
Mm-hmm.
like I that's why I found it a little more plausible because often when the other third, like the other parent, like also demonizes the other one, usually says a lot that maybe this was a relationship that wasn't really built to succeed from the get-go. And that just adds to the dynamic and to the potential bigger rift. So in this story, I did believe it, but I agree with you where I think you tweak a couple of things and it becomes like, no, this is totally unrealistic. Every character hates him. What the heck? Like, they pull that one off. I've been like, it doesn't seem plausible.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, just in general, like just having your parent around is so important. Where like if the parent is sort of away on business, like it could be even for good reasons. Just not being around your kid is generally not good for establishing a healthy relationship with them, right? And in this case, in this movie, in the context of this movie, it didn't turn out bad in the end because they end up reconciling. But that does not always happen with parents that are not around their kids.
So I know you wanted to jump into the ending, so I'll let you. What you wanted to target a little bit because the ending was kind of like, it was almost, how do I describe it? Like you could. It was almost like it's where it felt like a book. It felt like the last chapter of a book. That's how I would describe that ending.
Yeah.
It was very like.
Yeah, no. You could see it coming, but it was ending in kind of a dramatic fashion. But I just thought it was interesting the way they sort of played it out. In terms of the whole thing was an analogy sort of like it was interesting to see the son will sort of try to find a way to comfort his father. You could tell he was really uncomfortable at first because he's like, he's like, I'm not a storyteller like you are. I don't really know how this story ends. You never told me this. And then but he wants to console his dad, so he kind of starts to improvise, right? And the whole thing was that you need to return to the river because he tells him so many times about the story of him catching the big fish. And so he kind of realizes that in this case, he is the big fish. And so he sort of, what I found fitting, it's kind of like a book, how it started with him catching the big fish. It's kind of how it ended, is the fish returning to the river. So it really is a story coming full circle at that point in the ending, and in that way, it is really like a book.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add, because I agree with your take, is that it was that last scene was where I think the son, in a sense, reconciled with his dad, and they made a story together, and I think that's what Edward Bloom wanted in the end, because I think he intentionally didn't tell him that last story for that specific reason, and so it allows him to create a story together that he can. And we see at the end, right? He shares these stories with his own sons, or kids, and I think that last story is like almost like that passing of the baton, because Edward Bloom like says a couple of times in the movie that we're just different types of storytellers, right? I like to, chat about it, and you like to write, and so because if you're like, let's say, a factual news or like a journalist, and still in some subtle ways, you're crafting a story, right? Like, what do you start with? What do you end with? As somebody who reads a lot of journalistic news, it's still a story. That's why we call it, this news story, right? It's just a different type of story. And so I think these two storytellers, they connect on the one thing they truly did have in common, which was storytelling, which I found very poetic.
No, I mean, this whole movie comes full circle. That's how you just sort of describe the end. Or that's how I would describe the ending. And then like at the very last thing is at the funeral, and you just see that all these characters that were part of his dad's film that he thought were just a complete fabrication were actually true. There were some details, like I had pointed out before, like with the conjoined twins. While they were not really conjoined, that was some of the fabrication that was added to make the story that much more incredible. Where in reality, they were just Chinese twins or Korean twins. Sorry, not Chinese, because it was the Korean War. But yeah, so they were two Korean twins who happened to be at the funeral, and they were all there reminiscing over their father and their experiences with him.
Yeah.
So, so did you enjoy this movie overall?
Yeah, I personally enjoyed this movie. Even though my rating is going to be like not low, but it's going to be average. But I'm just not the biggest Burton fan. I just have to say, like, I never fall in love with his movies. This is the closest, and I was like,
I didn't. I thought just in general this was a good film though.
Yeah, like, I think it's a solid movie. It's like a solid one that you can watch at Friday night, with the family. It's pretty safe. It's not like our next week's movie. So it's
safe, and it's got enough directorial creativity where I enjoy it.
Yeah,
and I like a lot of the I like the metaphor usage laced throughout the film, and how he didn't really directly or like explicitly state some of the interactions that were going on. It was sort of for you to read in between the lines and some of the symbolism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so you want to give your final ratings on this film?
Yeah. So my final rating is this movie is a solid 6 out of 10. So.
Okay. I give it a little higher. I'm going 7.
I just want to keep reiterating that 5 to me is average. So think of that as a C. And so this is kind of like B minus,
So that's your normalized scale.
Yes, because most people I've noticed that what they do is they'll say, because they think like in terms of schooling, right? Oh, 7 is average because that's a C, 70%, and then like 8, 9.
You're that hard grader that you have to what do you call it? Curve your grading system.
Exactly. Because I took many classes, and especially in mathematics, where like 50% was passing. I was like, what? I remember that this is going off a little bit, but I remember especially I think it was sophomore, it might have been freshman year. I was like 50%. I remember thinking that's gonna be easy. I was so naive, and then I was like, wow, like this is I can see why it's 50%. The average test score was 42. What?
Yeah.
So I have that kind of grading skill because I think probably just the way I went to school a little bit.
Your computer science side influencing your film grading.
Yeah. So, but you're right. It's usually to boost those people passing, they have to curve it like 20%. So that ends up being like, 50 is a 70.
They do. I remember I took my junior year to chemical thermodynamics. Average on our midterm was a 40%. And it was just like that was brutal, and it just like shifted. I think like you were gonna pass if you had like at least 20%.
That sounds about. I had upper division math courses that basically the teacher was like, if you just pass, there was 3 tests. There was obviously 2 midterms and the final. He's like, if you pass one of the tests with above 60, you will pass this class.
You pass.
Like, what? I was like, what? How bad are these tests? And I was like, oh, they're 4 question proof test. Oh, well, I'm screwed. Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, so that's our thoughts on this week's film. Next week we will be reviewing Sicario, so stay tuned. If you enjoyed our commentary on Big Fish this week, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for our next review. You take care. Bye.